Good evening and welcome to BBC News. There is no safe level of drinking. That's according to new guidelines on alcohol issued by the government, the first in 20 years. The latest recommended limits apply to both men and women equally for the first time. People should drink no more than the equivalent of 7 pints of average strength beer or 7 standard glasses of wine a week. That's 14 units of alcohol. And people should also have several drink-free days a week. Pregnant women shouldn't drink at all. That advice now brings England, Wales and Northern Ireland into line with Scotland. Critics say the advice smacks of the nanny state, as our health editor Hugh Pym reports.
It's certainly stirred up a big debate over how much it's sensible to drink and whether people need to be told to cut back on the alcohol they order at the bar or buy in the shops. The official line now is there's no such thing as safe drinking.
The risk is significant of over-drinking to people's health and their longevity. We are advising a low-risk amount, which is up to 14 units in 1 week, spread over a few days.
A key question for most drinkers: how much is it reasonable to consume in a week? There'll no longer be any difference between the recommended maximum amount which men and women might drink in a single week. The new guidelines for everyone will be no more than 14 units over that time. So what does that look like? Well, it's equivalent to about 7 pints of beer or lager, or about 7 medium-sized glasses of wine. But if you drink higher strength brands in both cases, that'll mean fewer drinks over the week. On this basis, for beer towards the lower end of the strength range, it's 3 fewer pints a week for men than the old guidelines. Lucy Rocker often drank a bottle of wine a day, but after drinking 3 one night, she ended up in hospital and quit there and then. She believes drinking's been glamorised and tougher guidelines are needed.
I grew up, came of age in the 1990s, so was subject to the whole Bridget Jones, ladette culture. And I think women of my generation have been told or sold this myth that wine is a treat, it's good for you, it's a nice convivial thing to do with your friends, and the health harms have been very, very much played down, even to the extent of promoting red wine as being good for us.
The guidelines will apply across the UK. We asked drinkers in Swansea for their views and whether they thought the government was going too far.
It is helpful, but people wouldn't take any notice. They will drink whatever they want to drink.
I think it's up to the individual. Whatever they want to drink is entirely up to them. People tend to drink more, thinking that, yes, I'm fine, 2 or 3 pints is nothing. But in actual fact, it's not.
It'll be some time before there's any firm evidence as to whether these new tighter guidelines make any difference to people's behaviour or their health. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
So the guidelines say there is no safe limit for drinking alcohol. And many people will be asking whether this ends the idea that moderate drinking can be good for the heart. Our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh has been weighing up the risks.
Everything we do carries risk. For those who drink 14 units of alcohol a week, the guidelines show that carries a lifetime risk of death of 1 in 100. That's higher than the 1 in 240 lifetime risk of dying in a traffic accident, but tiny compared to the 1 in 2 risk of smokers dying from their habit.
Perhaps an hour TV a night, and a bad diet, a couple of bacon sandwiches a week, and being a few kilos overweight. All of those have a greater risk to your long-term health than the low levels of alcohol being recommended in these guidelines.
It is the increasing evidence strongly linking alcohol with cancer that has led to these new guidelines. Let's look at 2 common cancers. 110 in every 1,000 women will get breast cancer. Now, if you drink up to 14 units, that number goes up to 130 per 1,000. Drink double the recommended amount, it goes up to 150 per 1,000. For men, 64 in every 1,000 will get bowel cancer, whether they drink nothing or stay within the 14-unit limit. But if they drink 21 units, the old limit, that number goes up to 84 per 1,000.
There are 7 types of cancer that are associated with alcohol consumption, and we know there's about 13,000 cases of cancer a year that are due to alcohol. So the evidence is quite clear, and we just need to communicate that to people so they understand the risks.
So is all alcohol bad? Well, not quite. The guidance shows that drinking up to 7 units a week, that's half a small glass of wine daily, does have a tiny protective effect, probably lowering the risk of heart disease. But it's really only a significant benefit for women over the age of 55. So for those opening a bottle of wine or down the pub tonight, the key message is the more you drink, the greater your overall health risk, especially from cancer. But small amounts of booze, spaced over the week, will be, for many of us, a health risk we're prepared to accept. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
Rob Lyons from the Institute of Ideas joins us now from our Millbank studio. Thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News this evening. How would you describe these new guidelines?
Ludicrous, laughable, any synonyms of those words? The idea that drinking more than a pint of weakish lager a day is a significant health risk. It seems to me to be a nonsense. And these guidelines, for example, seem to very much underplay the idea, the protective effect on heart disease and on stroke of drinking moderately. But in reality, this isn't really about health guidance or whatever. It's really about a kind of political thing about setting up the arguments for greater regulation of drinking, and I would expect that to come fairly soon. The idea that we're not going to stick to the guidelines, therefore the government has to step in and kind of cajole us into doing it by higher taxes or minimum pricing, that kind of thing.
But why would the chief medical officers in this country tell us this advice if there wasn't something to it?
If you look at the broad range of health interventions in the past decade or two, there's clearly a part of the medical profession, and seems to elbow its way to the top of the medical profession at the moment, that's got a real bee in their bonnet about our behaviour, about how we're killing ourselves and how we need to be protected from ourselves. And I don't think we do. I think that we're actually perfectly capable of making sensible choices that relate to our lives and how we want to live. And I think that we need less and less government regulation of these minutiae of our lives.
But surely the number of cases of diabetes, obesity, alcohol-related diseases that the NHS is having to treat bucks all that you've just said.
Well, obesity has been pretty flat for the last few years, despite many claims about how we're all going to be fat by 2050 or something. In fact, obesity rates have stayed pretty flat for about 10 years now, and so there is no time bomb there. Diabetes is an interesting case because a lot of that will be down to better diagnosis. The fact that people are now going out and looking for diabetes cases will have had some influence on those numbers. And as for alcohol, we're drinking less than we did 10 years ago on average. We actually have more teetotalers in this country now than we've had for a very long time. So the idea that that we're drowning in alcohol, that we're spending most of our time incapable because of we're knocking back one bottle of wine after another, doesn't accord with the facts.
Judging by how previous guidelines have been followed or not, how well do you think we as a general public in this country will follow the new guidelines? Well,
I think these guidelines have been met by bemusement by most people. I think they recognise, in a common sense kind of way, that actually you can drink quite a bit more than that without coming to any significant harm, apart from maybe a banging hangover if you do too much in one go. So I don't think that most people will stick to these guidelines. I think that a few of the kind of worried the people who fret about health will probably start feeling more guilty about that glass of wine. But most people will just laugh it off, and probably by Monday morning most people won't remember what these guidelines were. As I said, I think it's much more a political thing about trying to reclassify a lot of the population as hazardous drinkers rather than normal drinkers as they were until today.
Rob Lyons from the Institute of Ideas, thank you very much. We'll find out how that story is covered in tomorrow's front pages at 10:30 and 11:30 this evening in the papers. Our guests joining us tonight are Caroline Frost, entertainment editor at the Huffington Post UK, and David Williamson, the political editor of Media Wales.